This morning we're talking about the recently published book Fearless Journeys, the story of innovation in 5 American orchestras. Fearless Journeys was made possible by a generous grant from MetLife with support also from the National Endowment for the Arts. And the League obviously is deeply grateful to both MetLife and the NEA for their support of this project. The book Fearless Journeys, and how many of you have the book or have seen the book or have read the book? Okay, a question came up in the last session, how can I get it? You can download it free of charge from the League's website, or you can contact the League and the hard copy is available for purchase. And I encourage all of you to get the book. I know 1 copy was mailed to every orchestra who's a member of the League, so there is one floating around your organizations. The book is a sort of 3-pronged effort over the next few months to talk about the stories of the 5 orchestras you see here on the podium. There was the book, there are the 2 sessions we're doing this morning, and then over the summer we'll be recording a series of podcasts which will be available to you sometime late summer, early fall, and they'll be available on the League's website. And in those podcasts we'll go into some more detail about specific aspects of the innovative practice of these organizations. So I encourage you to follow that story, and any questions you have that are not answered by any of the components of this rollout, I'm sure that the orchestras would be happy to speak to you if you call them. Our panel represents the 5 orchestras in the book. I'm Catherine Macciariello of Creative Arts Consulting, and I'll be the moderator this morning. And let me just introduce the panel who will be speaking shortly. Starting on my right is Ryan Fleur, who's the president and CEO of the Memphis Symphony. Don Fox, Executive Vice President for Business Operations and Chief Financial Officer for the Atlanta Symphony. Eileen Jeanette, Vice President of Artistic and Orchestra Operations at the Pacific Symphony. Sarah Lutman, President and Managing Director of the Saint Paul Chamber Orchestra. And Chad Smith, Vice President of Artistic Planning at the Los Angeles Philharmonic. We're really fortunate to have a number of perspectives at the table this morning. Together, all of us hope to share with you our insights into the 5 individual fearless journeys that are described in the book that you have. While what the orchestras did is really important, it's also important to realize that the case studies that are in the book were completed 1.5 years ago. So everybody at the table today is in a different place than 1.5 years ago. So what they did was interesting, but I think what we want to focus more on today is how they did it, because it's how they did it that really tells the story. Because after all, I mean, it's called Fearless Journeys for a reason. So innovation doesn't have a beginning and it doesn't have an end. It's a continuing way of life. And we hope that we'll be able to capture that journey a bit for you today, along with all the characteristics and readiness factors that go into creating an authentically innovative or intrinsically innovative organization. The book itself in the final chapter does look at a number of commonalities among these orchestras. Among them are a committed team of leaders, an expansive vision for the future, an open artistic model, a person who serves an explicit role in the organization to bring constituencies together. We call it the integrator. Use of partnerships, a wide and prolific use of partnerships. And finally, and certainly probably most important, a basis on a foundation for artistic excellence and the integrity of music that helps move the innovation forward. So today we are going to talk just briefly about the content of each orchestra's project, but we're going to move really quickly into talking about the journeys that they're still making as they move forward. We'll hope to demonstrate a number of behaviors, common characteristics that can be replicated at home for you, because the projects themselves some aspects of them will be relevant to you and your organizations, some will not. But the practices and the behaviors and the sort of cultural underpinnings of the innovation process that you'll hear from these orchestras are absolutely applicable to anybody, no matter what size, in what city, in what culture, or what operational model. So that's where we really want to focus this morning's discussion. At the end, we'll have time for your questions, and we hope that you will bring them to us in a spirit of collaboration and reciprocal exchange. So with that, I'm going to start with the panel, and I'm going to ask everybody to give a very brief 2 to 3 minute contextual description of their work so that you can hear just a little bit about the project that was described in the book, the work that was described in the book, who the people are, the context, the challenges that the orchestras were facing as they began their innovative journey. And with that, we'll have a foundation for moving forward into the substantive questions of the session. So we did this morning. I thought it worked well. Let's start in LA. We'll start with California. So Chad.
Good morning. Interestingly, when I was reading this book in preparation for this panel, I was struck that the LA portion was not specifically about one problem or one issue that we needed to deal with, but was really kind of an evolutionary thing that was happening over many years and decades. In fact, by the end of the 20th century, by the late 1990s, the LA Philharmonic had an extraordinarily strong artistic profile. We knew who we were. We could talk about kind of the innovative home for new music, etc. But our business model wasn't able to support that. We were running deficits, and we saw deficits going out into the future. And our board charged us to say this is not sustainable. We need to kind of really relook at this. We had a broken financial model. We had audiences that were dwindling at an alarming rate. Subscribers kind of were leaving our series. And the landscape of Los Angeles itself had changed around us and was not necessarily reflected in who we were as an institution anymore. So we had some pretty big problems. And we were also having an ongoing kind of management challenge. Our visionary leader, Ernest Fleischman, had retired in 1997. There were some years of some trying times for a couple of years. And then in 2000, Deborah Borda was brought in to right the ship and really kind of make us an orchestra of the 21st century. And so she, with strong board leadership, asked the team to come together in a very collaborative and new way. We created a panel called the Inaugural Planning Committee to help us launch what would be the new Philharmonic with the opening of Walt Disney Concert Hall. And we changed basically so many of the assumptions that we had for our organization. We took a very strong look at our programming. We created things called identity programs, and we really upped our revenue generating side of our business. Just for a small example, in the winter of 2002, we sold $6.5 million worth of tickets in our winter season. When we opened Walt Disney Concert Hall, with the change in mix of programming, we were at 20 million. And that allowed us to really push forward these identity programs. It also allowed us to really engage with our community in a fundamental way. So our challenge was relevance within our community, but really at the most basic, it was that we couldn't sustain who we were. And we really had to take a really hard look at what are new ways of thinking, what are new ways of generating money, and what are new ways of kind of making ourselves important within our community.
Okay. Great. We'll move on to the Pacific Symphony in Orange County, who also took a hard look at its role in the community and began thinking about contextual programming in that light. And I think it's a nice parallel to move to you, Eileen.
Thanks, Kathy. So the Pacific Symphony is located in Orange County, California, and we're home of some very beautiful beaches. We're home of Disneyland, and we're also the home of the Desperate Housewives. And what's really interesting about Orange County is that it does not have a city center. It is 34 distinct communities that each have their own flavor and their own personality. And our challenge it was to try to bring together this community of people who do not have a long-standing tradition of classical music knowledge or experience into our concert hall and into our programming, and make it meaningful for them, and something that they would leave a lasting impression on them. So I get asked a lot, what is contextual programming? So here's my stab at it. To us, it's when you take a single piece of music or a group of pieces of music and layer on various elements, including providing information about the composer, his or her life, the work itself, and the conditions in the world at the time the work was created. And this can be done by doing so many things to the concert. You can change up the concert format. You can add elements to a performance, including things like video or dance or theater, special lighting, special staging. And you should create an open environment where you may even choose to challenge your audience with a question that you pose at the beginning of each of your programs. And for us, the contextual programming in the most recent year has started to extend beyond the concert hall, into our lobbies, into our outdoor areas, into our website, into everything that we do with our audiences, so that it builds this environment for learning and for enjoyment of some wonderful music. And at the Pacific Symphony, we're most notably known in our contextual programming for our American Composers Festivals, which we have been doing since the year 2000. And those festivals started with Dvorak in America. Most recently, they've become a little bit more audience-focused, and we've done, this last year was The Greatest Generation, where we actually looked at how people and how their fortitude helps them face times of adversity. We looked at the music of the 30s and 40s and felt like it really did apply to this time in our history as well, with the crummy economy that we're all dealing with. Our innovation team at Pacific Symphony includes our music director, Carl St. Clair, who is quite a visionary and was doing contextual programming before there was ever a template for it. Our very passionate leader, John Forsythe, as our president, and Joseph Horowitz, who's our artistic advisor, who adds a little bit more of a scholarly side to the conversation, but is no less passionate. And he loves to connect music with the other humanities. And my role on the team is I'm the integrator that Kathy mentioned earlier. And so I try to pull together everyone, and once decisions are made, flow those through our musicians, our guest artists, and the technical people that we use to create our programs. And Pacific Symphony is very honored and thrilled to be considered innovative in the eyes of the League, and we're so thrilled to be included here.
Great. Let's move on to Memphis, who took a somewhat different approach.
Sure. Thank you, Kathy. And we don't have Disneyland or the Desperate Housewives, but we do have a very.
You might have Desperate.
Yeah, we do have some Desperate Housewives. But we have a very rich music heritage in Memphis, and it tends to be centered on the birthplace of rock and roll and the blues and Elvis and Justin Timberlake, and crunk was invented in Memphis. And we also, Memphis is a city that it's geographically somewhat isolated in terms of where the next population centers are, and we also are about to be the first community, the first metropolitan area in the country that is majority minority African American. And we asked a question very early on that is really simple: that why, if the Memphis Symphony went away tomorrow, would 98% of Memphis care? If we died, and we didn't like the answer, and that started us on this journey that's ended up to where we are today. So in the book, when you see the book, the innovative work will talk about artistically, infused or artistically built partnerships where we work with a charter school. We have a very close relationship with our largest corporation in town, FedEx. But really what the innovation is, what we've been doing is in creating in a cross-constituent way, and that emphasis on cross-constituent, board, musicians, staff, getting everybody, the right people involved to develop a new value proposition for the Memphis Symphony. And by that, the old value proposition was that basically we existed to make great music, sell tickets, raise money. And it kind of probably sounds familiar to what most of you still do with your orchestras. And we didn't find that resonating in Memphis. And ultimately the value proposition that we collectively came up with was that our orchestra will do anything that is first artistically meaningful for the artist and whomever the recipient is. Second, meets a genuine community need, not an orchestra need, a community need. And third, you could tie to a revenue source. So when you talk about community need, there is a need in Memphis for incredible performances of Beethoven and Mozart. But there's also tremendous need for talent retention, and there's tremendous need for adult role models, and on down the line. So we deliberately, we talked about that, we created it, and it then took a long time to get that introduced into the culture. We took a series of steps. We went through some comprehensive planning. We introduced a musician enrichment fund for which our artists could pursue professional development opportunities at their own initiative. We launched these pilots that you read about in the book. We created side letters to our master agreement and ultimately changed our master agreement to accommodate what we were doing. And then it's culminated in what's happened after the book into actually creating a concert series entirely produced by our musicians. But ultimately it came down to addressing that key need of why would our community care if we died tomorrow.
Great. Thanks. Ryan talks about a new value proposition, and I know in Saint Paul they talk about the new artistic model. So let's move to Sarah. And Sarah wasn't there for the Fearless Journey, original Fearless Journey. So let's hear about where we are today.
Thank you, Kathy. Yes, the Fearless Journey that the Saint Paul Chamber Orchestra went on didn't happen when I was the leader. It happened with the leadership of Bruce Kopic, our former president. By the way, so many people have asked me about him, and he's doing really quite well, enjoying his garden and doing a lot of volunteer work and coming to lots of concerts. And also Lowell Notaboom, now chair of the League Board, who was our board chair at the time. And the change that's described in the book, since so many of you didn't read it, is our move from having a single music director to functioning under a collaborative artistic model where we invite artistic partners to come play with the orchestra. Their commitment is to come 3 years in a row for at least 3 weeks. And they serve 3-year renewable terms. And they represent a range of interests and specialties. And the orchestra members, therefore, have taken on a good deal of the role of working with management on artistic planning and artistic personnel. So you can read all about it in the book, and I'd encourage you to do so. But in our case, that particular innovation occurred at the same time that the organization was inspired by a strategic plan that was a deep and long and, from what I understand, arduous process, some 40 meetings of all constituents in the organization, musicians, staff, and orchestra, with good facilitation, that decided, among other things, that the organization aspired to be clearly distinctive in artistic profile, and that the downstream effect of that aspirational goal, which motivates me a lot every day, because I think clearly distinctive is, as Chad has just described, it's sort of like them's as marching orders, had really caused us to turn the entire organization inside out and look at what that was going to require, not only in terms of the simple idea of distinctiveness from our Minnesota orchestra, with whom we share our community, but also distinctive internationally, and really adding something to the cultural dialogue that's existing in the world. Some of the other areas of innovation that have occurred since that plan was developed, which we were asked in the earlier session, did any of us use a planning model? And we did. We were very much inspired by Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. We're changing our governance practices, and identification of a clear business model, strategies to support that, which led to expansion of our neighborhood concerts, a complete reduction in ticket prices, and an expectation in our organization that we will work towards shared goals as board, staff, and musicians. And I'll just stop there and let you keep going.
Okay, great. So let's move on to our host and ask Don if you would talk about Atlanta's experience.
Thank you, Kathy. First of all, let me welcome you all on behalf of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra to our fair city, and on behalf of the city itself. It's great to have you here. The chapter on the symphony talks about a couple of innovations as a byproduct of the way that we do things, what I call our way of life. So you might read about the War Room, which was a topic of a session yesterday. You might read about the Atlanta School of Composers, which was just next door last hour. You might read about a construct called the New Era Team, or what we call NET, which is a cross-constituent, multi-layered think tank that is all about ideation and problem solving and innovation. But at the core of that, I think I come to what Chad said, and that is that what we have at the symphony is a fertile soil, a wonderful mix of culture and leadership that allows free thought, that allows for innovation as not as a byproduct, but as actually what we do. The recognition that staying still and stagnating really can't get us to where we need to be. So the notion of promoting free thought, that where there's no recrimination, where there's no a value set put on what one says or doesn't say, really allows for the kind of thought that creates things like the War Room and the New Era Team. There was also a recognition that the future didn't look so bright at the symphony, and we're not alone in that, I don't think. We built a financial model that was fairly sophisticated and integrated that could help us look down the road, and we didn't like what we saw, and so that also allowed for innovation and thought, and we put together again cross-constituent, board member, staff, and staff at the full range of the hierarchy, if you will, musicians, volunteers together. And we had different folks leading these various discussions around how do we think about the future of the ASO. And out of that came this diversified business model that really defines us today, where we have a significant revenue stream that comes from genres that are not purely classical. But it is this whole notion of the soup, if you will, Kathy, that allows this to happen.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I think you hear some very common terminology coming from everybody. The words cross-constituent, collaboration, new models, new orientation, community orientation are words that cut across all five of these stories. And I think embedded in that are a couple of really important questions that I'd like to explore here. Everybody also talked a little bit about crisis of one sort or another that drove this thinking. And interestingly, I think in many fields, innovation is often initially driven by crisis. People do things because they realize they have to do them. We're going to talk a little bit later about how we sustain that or how one might enter into similar kinds of activities, even though they may not feel that they're driven by crisis, because I think the learning from what they've been through is applicable to a number of situations. But I'm interested in the structures that everybody's been talking about in terms of the cross-constituent collaboration, because in any sort of shift from a traditional way of doing things to a new kind of practice, there often have to be really dramatic shifts in leadership, the concept of leadership, the concept of the relationship of the organization to the art form, the concept of the organization to its community. So let's start a little bit with leadership, because I'm hearing from all of you that strong leadership within the organization is incredibly important to advancing this work, but that sometimes it doesn't come in the most conventional of ways, and that structures have to be in place to really draw out that leadership in the organization. So if you could each talk a little bit about what your current leadership construct is and how that is a shift in assumption from what some people might see as conventional practice. Ryan, you want to start?
Sure. We've learned, not only did we kind of build this partnership from FedEx, but we've actually learned a lot from FedEx. And one of the things that we've learned in building our culture, which is very much a culture of listening, is that FedEx's business model is not about shipping a box from point A to point B. It's about people, service, profit. You identify and recruit the right people. You then have those people deliver the right service, and then actually you don't worry about the rest. The profit will follow. So for us, it's making sure we have the right leadership team on staff, having the right board members, and then we already have a base of tenured musicians, and how do we tap into that tenured musician base, into that creativity? And that gets to the heart of the cross-constituent notion. So what we've really been able to do is tap into leadership on every level. And particularly if you read the Symphony Magazine article about this Opus 1 series that developed, it just shows when you're able to create a forum for musicians to try to solve problems, you can come up with really creative solutions that generate revenue from unexpected sources.
Yeah. Go ahead. Chad, let's jump to you.
For us, it was a change in the way that we approached challenges at the organization. Interestingly, Ernest is with us, it seems, almost in every one of these panels, and an amazing visionary. His management style was quite different from the management style currently. It was, on staff, it was always kind of joked that you come to Ernest with a problem and he'll solve it. And Deborah took a very different approach, and she said, you come to me with a solution. And so what that meant was that she had empowered the staff to make recommendations, to assemble teams from across, again, this is going to be a common thread, from across all levels of the organization to come together, approach a problem, identify resolutions, and really then say, here's our recommendation. And that was really fundamental. It was a culture change for the organization. As I mentioned, there was a group that came together for our major moment, which was the opening of Walt Disney Concert Hall, called the Inaugural Planning Committee. And that had everyone together identifying every aspect of opening a concert hall, whether it was artistic, and so at that time my predecessor was doing a lot of the presentations of our opening season, but it would, each team member would come in and lay out their specific areas of responsibilities, and behind these closed doors, everyone commented on it. So we had, it was perfectly acceptable for the CFO to say, I don't get that program. And we had to be able to kind of justify, and we had to be able to kind of build consensus around what we were doing in the same way that his financial modeling had to make sense to all of us. And that was a transformative moment, and it is it's very much a part of the culture now. Every major decision that the organization makes, we put together a task force. And one of the things that we found is that we're a fairly large organization. And we have for an orchestra, we have a fairly broad set of needs that we need to address. And communication wasn't always the most effective in a vertical way. So we started putting members on these teams who were more junior staff members and mid-level staff members and senior staff members, so that, one, we could hear about problems that perhaps we at the senior team were not necessarily kind of noticing early on, but also that we could create a shared language. So that in our senior staff meetings, Deborah and the senior staff would kind of identify, how do we talk about this problem, how do we address it, and how do we put the message out? And then we could meet with our task forces so that our junior members, when they're out to lunch with their colleagues or going out to drinks afterwards, they were sharing the same language. And it allowed us to build consensus. And we took that message, and we also did it with our artistic programming, so that all across the organization, whether you were a ticket seller or whether you were working in the development office or whether you were working in the PR office, you could talk about the essential nature of what we do and why we do it.
Don, could you jump in a little bit and talk about how this works at Atlanta?
Yeah, I think in Atlanta, leadership certainly starts at the top. It's natural, but we have what I would define as a fairly egalitarian society that we exist in, particularly as it relates to innovation and forward thinking. We have vertically, like Chad has spoken of, we have vertically and horizontally integrated teams that really tackle most of what we do, more so outside the realm of the ordinary, less so to some extent within the ordinary, but more so outside the realm of the ordinary. And out of that comes great opportunities for folks that you would never have imagined leading a discussion, leading a project, or leading an opportunity. It's also a wonderful environment for mentoring, which I think that organizationally we pride ourselves on, and that is helping folks grow. Because the more you empowerment's an important word in all of this, the more you empower folks at all levels of the institution to contribute and to speak without a fear of, well, that's stupid kind of response, is really, really important. But what that allows for is, to the point of Kathy's comment about leadership in strange places, it really allows for leading discussions, whether it's from a musician in the New Era team or whether it's from a staff member regarding a program. And it's really just a way of life for us.
Sarah, how do you do this and structure this in an orchestra, probably more than any of the others, where musicians are such an integral part of the team?
We had a panel previous to this, and one of the things I was talking about is what are the requirements of a 21st century leader who wants to lead an innovative organization. And I think our charge is to create a leader-full organization, rather than feeling like we're the leaders, that every single person who works there or volunteers has the capacity to have the best idea in the room, and that part of our job is to be great facilitators of that, which is an art and science of its own that requires study and practice, just like learning an instrument. But in terms of our actual decision-making structure, in our contract, our musicians form both an artistic vision committee, which is essentially an artistic planning group, and an artistic personnel committee, which has personnel responsibility. And each of those is comprised of rotating, term-limited 3 musicians, and then 2 permanent staff positions in both instances. And these folks meet very regularly. I would say with the Artistic Vision Committee, we're probably in contact with them during the season on almost a daily basis. They oversee the rehearsal schedule. They help us vet ideas for debuts. They help us do something that you might not think about, which is sometimes artistic partners want to do the same programs, and we have to figure out who gets to do the next Beethoven cycle and things like that, which is fun, and otherwise help us coordinate the extremely complicated arrangement we've created for ourselves, actually, compared to having a single person accountable for the decisions. The benefit is a more engaged orchestra, and I think all of us feel that that's palpable on the stage. I think on the personnel side, the structure is a little trickier because, as it's described in the report, it's tough to be in an evaluative role with your colleagues who you then need to turn around and rehearse with. And I think we have more work to do in how we organize that part of our business, frankly. That's been one of the more trying parts of our model because of the conflict between togetherness and objectivity and the roles of management versus players in our environment.
Ryan, could you do you have similar way of approaching decision making now in terms of sort of cross-constituent task force approaches? I'm interested in hearing from a smaller orchestra how you can deploy your resources.
Well, we have a critical role, and I think it's a similar role that you play, Eileen, in Pacific, where Lisa Dixon, our Chief Operating Officer, I think Lisa's here in the room, but that she is really, in a lot of ways, a facilitator, a communicator, can help as we've built this culture of decision-making that happens in sometimes random places, and sometimes conflict comes up from that we can resolve that conflict pretty quickly. And we've learned over time how to do that. It's not a perfect process, and it's not even necessarily a formalized process, but knowing that there's one role, that's one person that kind of knows everything and uses that information, in a way to promote transparency is absolutely critical.
I'd actually like to sort of move on and start with Eileen with this question. Is that none of the leaders that you see from these orchestras are delicate daisies, and neither are the executive directors who maybe are not here, and certainly not their music directors or artistic partners. So I'd like to ask Eileen to sort of start and talk about how this more horizontal, collaborative, inclusive way of dealing with everything in the organization, including the art making, interfaces with the traditional role of the music director, and how does the artistic leadership in each of your organizations function in this new environment?
Well, we are quite lucky that Carl St. Clair is such an open and visionary leader, and always has been since he started with Pacific Symphony back in 1990. What's funny is my role with the symphony, I've been with the symphony for almost 5 years now. And when I came in, I was, there's a lot of big personalities and big opinions at Pacific Symphony, and they're all absolutely brilliant people and absolutely, all wonderful. And it was, I started to figure out that maybe one of the things I could do in my role was to bring those big personalities to a consensus. And so that's part of what my role is at the symphony. In terms of the artistic leadership and what to do with all this, what's funny is Carl has also been a music director in the German system quite a bit, and so he sometimes we have these funny conversations. He says, "Well, I just handed over my next 2 seasons worth of programs," and he said, "And it's going to take us, weeks and weeks and weeks of conversations with so many people to come up with one program," and he says it with kind of tongue-in-cheek, but he actually really appreciates all of the input. Every once in a while, for Carl, he needs to go off and make a decision, and then after hearing all of the input, and then come back and share with us what that decision is. And then from that point, we all just say absolutely and march forward together as a unified team.
Don, could you address that?
Yeah, in our way of programming and integrating what happens in the way that we operate from a as an institution as well as artistically is that everybody really does get to participate at the table. It's the war room concept is really at the core of how we operate artistically, where there are, again, fairly equal voices at the table. So Robert Spano, our music director, Evans Mirages, our director of artistic planning, our general manager. We have our marketing folks there. We have our development folks there. Sometimes I sit in, and that we all have a voice at what happens artistically. But it's part of the cultural fabric of how we operate, where it's a very inclusive and integrated conversation. We're very, very fortunate to have Robert, because I think that Robert's not really, he's cut from a different mold that allows for that to happen. But when we recruited Robert, that was a definition of what we were looking for, someone who could work within that sort of a construct.
Chad?
Ours is a little different, I would say. I mean, it's very collaborative, but the collaboration begins at a different point. And with Esapeka, in Esapeka, we had a leader who had a very clear identity of who he was as an artist. It was always I always, enjoyed kind of with my colleagues around the country kind of looking at each other's seasons without the names on it and saying, yeah, that's an MTT season, or that is an Esapeka season, or that is. For us, the collaborative nature came after the programs were kind of more fully formed. I always feel like my role as the VP of Artistic Planning is that I need to kind of to interpret and then implement the vision of our music director. The institution of the Philharmonic is frankly too big, and the amount of repertoire that we go through and the number of concerts that we present, it's too large for our music director to kind of have a hand in on a regular basis. He can't kind of comment on every soloist and every piece and every opening work. So it's our job, my job, and Deborah Borda's, to really kind of put together a season that we think looks like that person. And then Esapeka and now Dudamel will come and they'll sit down and they'll look at it and they'll say, yeah, change this, or maybe this person needs to kind of do something else. And then we sit down with in our group, and we get buy-in, and we get pushback, and we get a commentary like, this is going to be really hard for us. And it's never, you need to change this. It is, this is going to be hard for us, or we might have a problem here because of the timing. And then we can make those decisions about whether we're going to muscle through this, or whether we're going to kind of adapt. And what we found in this process from an artistic standpoint, because that is kind of obviously my area of where I do most of my work, is that when we were going through the opening of the concert hall, we needed to kind of re-up our game. And we needed to cut through the cultural clutter of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is the second largest city, obviously, but it's the first largest media market. So what we had to do was create programs and create events that would, from time to time, kind of raise a flag up through into our city and say, here's where we are and here's what we're doing. And that's when we came up with the concept of identity programming, where we would create. We would do programming on a horizontal and vertical basis. We would do programming horizontally for our subscribers, but we would do vertical programming, meaning concentrated identity programs within a very short period of time, which would then give us a real voice. And we really started institutionalizing our festivals, our multidisciplinary projects, and we started using all of the resources of the Philharmonic. When we moved into the hall, we started presenting, as Atlanta did, different types of music beyond our core classical repertoire. We would do pop music, and we would do jazz and world music and Broadway series, all of that. And instead of just seeing it as a revenue positive presentation, which it has to be, we only present non-core classical repertoire if it is revenue positive for us. We started integrating it into these vertical moments in our season. So we're able to use the platform of the Philharmonic and the resources of the Philharmonic to create festivals which now have the orchestra at the heart, but also have pop music and world and jazz, and that creates so many points of entry for audiences. We also had to kind of step away from this idea that we were a funnel. We were doing pops and we were doing this so that people would end up at the classical series. That's not where we are today. We do kind of a multiplicity of programming to support our core activities, which is the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, but we don't do them as a means to an end other than financial.
Mm-hmm. Sarah and Ryan, you also have a high level of involvement from musicians as well. I'm curious if sort of you two might address, having heard what you have from your colleagues. So what are the characteristics? What does it take from an artist in the organization to be an effective part of this new paradigm, for lack of a better word? I mean, it is really a fundamental change in sort of the assumption of what makes an effective organization. It's no longer hierarchical. It's much more horizontal. It has both vertical and horizontal planes. It's much more complex than the old way of doing business. What does it take in particular from the artists? And then I'm going to ask Don and Chad to maybe talk about what does it take from the executive leader, and I'm going to ask Eileen to talk about what it takes from the board. So that we could, really dig down into some of these characteristics, because I know that a number of you have already said this is what we looked for when we looked for Bob Spano. This is what we looked for, and I think being clear and being able to articulate those qualities is key to being able to sustain any momentum that has been developed.
Sure, it takes to start something like this. It takes good leadership amongst our musicians. And courage, and we've had a couple of key musicians that were willing to kind of step out of the traditional role. Some of you may have come from the entrepreneurial musician panel where you met our concertmaster, and she was one of those key musicians that helped do that. And to say we can take on the traditional role we always have been. We've have an institution that's typically treated us either like a servant who comes in through the back door or a gifted child, and or we can take this onto ourselves and say we want to be part of the solution. And it doesn't happen overnight. Again, we've described a lot of these kind of steps that we've taken along the way. And as we've slowly built trust, as we've slowly added these pilot projects, negotiated side letters to our CBA, have allowed our musicians to take additional steps, and they see that they're actually listened to. What's ultimately happened is our collective bargaining agreement. We're not there yet, but we're pretty far along. Is essentially not a Bible or a rule book, but rather an after-the-fact means to ensure that we're deploying the right, the right system for our musicians to communicate and to act. And that's been, it requires a big step of faith and a lot of trust, and our musicians have been willing to show that.
I think that musician involvement is a work in progress in every orchestra in America that I've heard about, and the Saint Paul Chamber Orchestra is the same. I think for many of our musicians, our transformation has been exhilarating, and some of the longtime members say that they've never been more excited to be a member of the orchestra, where they really feel that they are choosing what they play, with whom they play, and where they play, and that they have, not just input, but authority in some cases over how things happen. I will say also, though, that I don't think that this is for everyone, that they're going to be members of the orchestra who really don't want to spend the time. They don't have the interest. They don't have the repertoire knowledge. They don't want to listen to CDs of a lot of different recordings by a debut artist. They just don't want to do it. And that over time, that creates a kind of hierarchy, an unintended hierarchy in the orchestra, that has its own form of sort of someone really is the music director-itis within the players themselves. But it only occurs because of the imbalance of interest, not because anyone really has more authority. It's just that they exert more enthusiasm and participation. So these are some of the downstream effects of what Bruce so ably put in place that we now get to kind of work on, as we go forward. But one thing that I think is very interesting is, why do people come audition for the Saint Paul Chamber Orchestra? And do they have any idea what they're getting into? Or are they just taking another audition? Because when you join the orchestra, my impression is you are ready to, join a highly participatory organization that we're going to expect you to be on board committees. We're going to want you to come to all kinds of meetings that aren't in your service schedule, and we're going to think ill of you if you don't show up, and we want you to read the material and all this sort of thing. Or did you just show up to audition like any other musician because you want a job? And, an informal poll of our most recent musicians, they didn't know what the expectation was that's non-musical. And I think we all have to work some of that out too. Now, obviously, you want the best players to get the job, but I think the onboarding and integration of musicians into the new culture is kind of the next frontier for us, because just being the best violinist who showed up that day and then went through, by the way, our extremely rigorous joining the orchestra process that our own musicians have put in place, which is a 3-year pre-tenure period. How do we help develop people who weren't trained to be part of a culture like this to be active contributing members who will ensure the society's future? So that's actually a subject of high interest to me.
What does it take from the executive leader to nurture and stimulate this kind of curious environment, or environment of curiosity?
Well, I'll start. I think that we had in the last session we talked about strong leadership, and Ryan was quick to say that doesn't mean strong personality, and I think that that's right. Although I think strong leaders have strong personalities, it doesn't mean that it has to be an overpowering personality. I think that what certainly we've been witness to here is an odd word in leadership that I would call humility, that allows for this freedom of dialogue. But it also, we have talked about staff, and perhaps in the earlier session, that you need to have the right players. You need to have the right folks at the table. So I think part of the responsibility of leadership is to ensure that we bring on board folks that fit the mold of the way that we do business. Sarah's comment about musicians is, I shake my head because we have the same challenge, is that we have a very participative, we're not quite like you are, but we have a very participative environment where musicians are active in the thinking and decision-making of the institution, and we expect that. Mm-hmm. But recruiting musicians that know that they need to do that is a separate issue. But words that resonate with me when it comes to how we lead and the characteristics that are important in leadership are having a thick skin, having humility, having an empowering approach to management. The title Fearless Journeys really is about not just fearless journeys, but fearless thinking and fearless leadership and the courage to think outside the box and to not be afraid to fail. This was another conversation that we had at the last session as well.
Yeah, now I'd like to pick that up in just a second and ask Chad first if he has anything he'd like to add about the way positive executive leadership can influence the processes that you're all involved in. And then I actually would like to ask about failure, because it was a very interesting conversation.
Sure. I think one of the things that we've come away with in our leadership team and driven by Deborah is a constant questioning of everything that we do. This was, as I said, we looked at every aspect of our business, of our model, whether it was how we interacted with our board and how the institution was reflective of the board priorities, whether it was how we were reflective of our community, how it was reflective of the musicians in our orchestra. But what we have taken out of that process of opening Walt Disney Concert Hall and having to rethink who we are so that we could survive and now thrive is this sense that we question everything that we do. We question every, whether it is how we approach media, whether it is, is this the right allocation of resources? Is this the, how are we actually going to kind of judge success for each of these programs? So it's really setting out, with Deborah, it is about kind of setting clear metrics that allow us to kind of make a decision as a group of whether this is good or whether this is not working. But she does so in a very in a directive way. Deborah's a very strong personality, and she expects her leadership team to also have strong opinions. And one of the things that we do at the Philharmonic is that we come into a room as a team, we close the doors, and we sometimes slug it out. But what we also do, and this is absolutely directed by Deborah, is that when that door opens, we are all on the same page and we are all saying the same thing. And whether or not our opinion is the direction that we've ultimately chosen to take on a decision, we are all on board. And that's something that dissension outside of those decision-making rooms is really not tolerated. We have to be a unified management team, and that has to spread to our respective departments. We need everyone on the same page, and that, I think, ultimately allows us to be a very big organization at $95 million and close to 280 paid concerts and 1 million sold tickets. We're a really big organization, but it also allows us to be nimble because once we make a decision, we just do it.
Yeah. And we actually talked at the first session about how this internal dynamic that happens within the staff also transfers to the board, because policies that are adopted at the board level, despite what kind of sort of creative dissatisfaction might exist in the dialogue, also needs to be solidified so that the entire institution talks with the same language and with the same purpose. And I'd like to just ask Eileen to say just a couple of words about what it takes for the board to provide the space for this kind of long-term, risk-taking, adventurous activity to occur within the organization.
Well, Sarah and I were duking it out this morning, and we both decided that we had the best board in the country. But what's really remarkable about the Pacific Symphony Board is, this probably won't be a surprise to you, but our American Composers Festival is not the highest ticket selling opportunity that we have during our season. And we're very lucky to have some wonderful funding from the NEA and some from other foundations. But our board has never once, in all the years that the ACF has been going on, said a negative word about it. They never questioned Carl's vision, his dreams, never said maybe we should rethink this or pull the plug. And that's a really wonderful organizational culture to work within. And even when the going has been getting tough in these last few years and the economy is so challenging for everyone, they see the vision of Carl. They see how helpful it is to the musicians to play that kind of repertoire, and they see how it's feeding our community, even if some people aren't participating. So we have a great board.
And I think you can see when you read the book as well that in many of these organizations, some incredibly dynamic and creative ideas have also emerged from the board, because the spirit of dialogue and open dialogue sort of permeates the organization. So it's not the thought that ideas and new directions are only stimulated by the artistic leadership or the staff leadership is not relevant in these organizations at all.
In Pacific, one of our board members has a real connection to the Syrian community. And he actually brought to us this idea about bringing in members of the Syrian National Orchestra to play traditional instruments with the orchestra and then do a collaborative concert. And we were actually, it took 5 years for the institution to be able to pull this off. But finally we did, and it was the most amazing artistic experience and also the most amazing cultural exchange experience. And we touched the Arab community, the Armenian community, the Syrian community. I mean, we had people coming from all over the Los Angeles, greater Los Angeles area to the concerts. And that came from a board member.
That's great. This morning, we in the conversation about boards, I made a comment that one of the really important things that boards do is provide space for the organization and tolerance within the organization for failure. And that was a word that really resonated with the group. And so Sarah, let's start with you, because
Honor. So I think that too many times the idea of innovation is linked to a success-failure dichotomy, and that it's really the wrong way to think about innovation, that if you adopt a scientific mindset, a scientist is seeking new knowledge and sets up structured experiments during which things are learned. If the hypothesis is disproven, the experiment was not a failure. It was just the basis of the next investigation to try to advance human knowledge and generate progress in understanding the universe. And I think that innovation is an inquiring approach. It's the questioning everything, and and what you're after is the learning and the thinking. And if something doesn't work, and we want to call that failure, that's a state of mind that isn't necessarily helpful to advancing what you're going to do next. And the other thing I'd say about that, as I was thinking during our little break, is that if you study the history of science, often experiments that were tried with some equipment at some time failed, that were tried later with more knowledge and different equipment, and then they succeeded. And so I think we have to be really careful when we're trying to create resilient, future-facing organizations, that we don't adopt this success-failure mindset.
Well, I think, it's also a failed experiment in terms of it didn't produce the results you were looking for. It may have produced results in another area that are surprising and surprisingly have surprising potential for the organization. So that kind of vigilance and discipline in trying and evaluating and learning is really what's fundamental to the whole process. Do you want to? Yeah.
Just the notion of innovation or change or creative thinking has a word that's inherent, and that's risk. And risk is not something that some of us in this room are comfortable with or familiar with, or it's not how we do our business. But if you're going to innovate, you're going to take risk, because it requires change and it requires stepping off the cliff. Risk also implies something possible other than what you expected the outcome to be. And so I think that it's really important, as you think about change, that you recognize that you've got to have a tolerance for risk that may not have been in your comfort zone before, that you need to have evolve if you want to be an innovative organization. I also think that this notion of if at first you don't succeed, try again is an important success element in successful innovation, because innovation it suggests something different, something new, and we're not all that smart to have all of the pieces in place when we walk down the path, and so you have to change and modify and morph, but you don't, if you believe that you're on the right path, you don't give up, you keep pushing down that path.
Sarah used you used the key word there, which is resilience, which is I think what you're talking about. And if you build into your structure, room for failure, then you ultimately won't fail.
Yeah. Chad?
Plus, when we think about these projects, we were charged again by our board, and interestingly, in our business in orchestra, we are so often operating with razor thin margins, right? We are just wanting to make sure that we end the year in the black. But many of our board members come from businesses where there is risk capital for these kinds of projects. And so what happened in Los Angeles is that our board, through this process, and once we had righted our ship enough, really charged to say, all right, now we want you to budget a certain amount of risk capital so that you can take these challenges. And we want you to determine what those metrics are for success, but they have to be different than our normal operations. And it's been really interesting. We as a group come together and we say, I have an idea. And we sit together and I say, I have an idea. It's something kind of strange. I don't know if it'll work, but I really want to try it. And so recently our head of marketing came and said, I want to take 1 or 2 concerts off subscription. Now, I know that sounds like a fairly radical thing to do. Why would you take something off subscription when you can guarantee to have 12 or 1,300 tickets sold if it's on subscription? But she said, we keep talking about our need to connect with our community and be reflective of Los Angeles, yet there's no opportunity within our current season for people to buy tickets who might not already be in the LA Phil family. So I want to take these 2 concerts, just 2 concerts with Gustavo, and I want to market it to a very different community. But you know that we there's tens of thousands or close to $100,000 of just guaranteed money in putting a concert on subscription. So this is a real risk to us. We could kind of fail. And what we found is that the board said, absolutely, we have to walk the walk because we are talking the talk. And it was a big success. We've also had failures like this. We started a new concert series on Friday nights where we wanted to kind of create opportunities, kind of theatricalize and bring people in and recreate first nights. It was a really interesting idea. We just couldn't get it right. After 3 seasons, we kept kind of putting resources into it, and we sat as a team and we said, this is not working. It's not going where we wanted to go. We need to end this. Mm-hmm. And that was a fairly kind of difficult process. But we also learned an enormous amount came out of that process. Mm-hmm. But the board was very supportive for us, and they said, we want you to make sure that you have dollars in your budget for which the normal indicators of success do not apply.
I want to open it to the discussion to questions for the last few minutes that we have, but I wanted to make one last observation and ask one final question of the panel. I think that years ago when the League and others began talking about we need to change practices, we need to change behavior, we need to change culture, there was a lot of pushback and resistance because the sort of conventional response to that was, well, if we start doing this sort of collaborative decision-making, if we change the way we do business, it will somehow negatively affect the artistic work that the organization does. Or if we shift our orientation to be more about our audiences or more about our community, it will somehow undermine the artistic aspirations and purpose of the organization. And I guess I just would like to ask the panel if they feel that today their orchestras are artistically stronger and have closer relationships to their communities as a result of the changes that they've made on their journeys. And you can use 1 word or 3 words, but make it brief.
Absolutely. I'd say, the music, no matter what you might have heard from what I'm describing, the music is at the heart of what we're doing, and the excellence is at the heart. It's simply that it's a means now instead of an end.
I think we're absolutely at our peak artistically.
I think the Saint Paul Chamber Orchestra is playing better than ever, and we have a larger and more engaged audience who gives us more support more frequently than ever before.
And I think that we are constantly changing. And I used to kind of say evolving, but that indicates that we are better or worse than where we were before. I think we are more reflective of our community, and I think that we are adapting in ways which we haven't always in our past adapted.
Mm-hmm. And at Pacific, I would say that the music making is at an extremely high level, and the music is always at the center of everything that we do. And right behind that is our audience, and our thinking has been shifting more now towards our audience, but music is obviously at the top.
All right, we have just a few minutes left, and there are 2 microphones. I would encourage anyone who has a question to step up, and we ask that you do use the microphone because the League is recording the session, and the panel will be happy to answer your questions.
I guess it's on? Yeah, it's on. Mark Feldman, Sacramento Philharmonic. I suppose that innovation, you just don't turn on a switch after all this work and innovation just happens. How do you negotiate that period when the old is still there and the new is coming on? And I suppose that can create some tensions and this whole idea of failure. You have a new innovation, you're trying it out, the old school is still in place in certain aspects, and perhaps ready to shoot down something even before it gets born. So how do you negotiate that period between the old and the new?
I would just say one thing, and then someone else might want to add to it. But it's if you focus on process rather than the idea, and say the idea doesn't have any validity without the process, that's what's gonna help alleviate that.
Okay, thank you.
I think it is process, and it's patience, and it's leadership, and it's also time. Ryan said in the earlier session about the length of time that it took. I think you said 4 years or so. This is not something that happens overnight, and it is about a cultural shift in your organization. So the other part is that it requires change, and with change you get discomfort, and with discomfort you'll have people leave. Some who should leave and some that you prefer not leave but need to leave. I mean, because you've got to get on board with the program.
And this is a place, I think, that boards can be especially helpful in understanding the shifting dynamics within the organization, and they have a critical role in nurturing the process. And sometimes, and in some organizations, it also takes outside help. It takes facilitation. It takes structures in place to foster the change along the way. But above all, it takes really purposeful attention. It's not something that just falls out of the sky and happens. It's carefully directed and carefully orchestrated to produce results. Anybody else have anything to add?
I do think that a lot of people are very uncomfortable in what I think of the wet dough stage of bread making. You're really not sure how much more flour you need to add. If you put in too much, you're going to have really bad loaves. If you put in too little, they're going to be soggy, sort of thing. And I think acknowledging people's discomfort and reminding them that usually you're working on ideas and not plans. Like, this isn't a plan yet. This is an idea we're working on. And try to liberate them from the end game and excite them about the process. A book that I really love is by Twyla Tharp called The Creative Habit. If you haven't read it, I think it describes her process of working on projects and how she organizes her creative mind, and I found it helps even people from industry, insurance or banking or something where you don't really think of, although they do innovate, that there are tools out there that can help bring people along. But to acknowledge their discomfort, I think, is very liberating to people. You don't have to like this.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank you all for being here this morning, and a special thanks to the panel. And I encourage you to get the book, Fearless Journeys, and to watch for the podcasts, which will come out toward the end of the summer. And I know the panel would, if you have questions of them later, be happy to entertain them if you want to call and talk about any of their work further. So again, thank you very much, and thanks to the panel.